on my side as well. Okay, so as I was saying to you, we have some serious issues at hand. So let me start by just looking at this concept of Islamophobia as a starting point, because it's often you find that when we are facing problems, the media likes to well, media seldom talks about it, but when they do try and explain or justify the conditions or the encounters which Muslim people encounter generally, then they talk about this concept of Islamophobia. And just to give you an idea of just how prevalent this is, and is that in 2022, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution which was sponsored by the 60 member states of the OIC, and actually designated the 15th March as the International Day to Combat Islamophobia. And that's quite significant if you consider that generally the plight or complaints or the lived experiences of Muslim people generally are not taken seriously in the mainstream media. So the fact that the UN now has this day, which of course is also questionable, I'm not quite sure what a day is supposed to do, but the fact that the UN recognizes the prevalence of Islamophobia tells you just how pervasive Islamophobia is. And the typical kind of explanations given in opposing it is to say that people should not be marginalized or maligned or treated differently, discriminately, or prejudiced against because of their Islamic identity. Now, immediately I want to say to you that I'm not too comfortable with using this term Islamophobia. I think there's always a risk when you categorize or name something, particularly when it includes atrocities, and you try and couch it into one term, which is what Islamophobia has tried to do, that there's a risk here that we can somehow package all anti-Muslim hostilities into one little title or one label. And I'm concerned here that when we talk about it just as the fact that every person, every Muslim who experiences Islamophobia, it has to be Islamophobia. And so what this does is when you try and label all experiences of prejudice or discrimination or hostility or downright antagonism, including indiscriminate killing, which of course the biggest one we saw would have been in Christchurch in 2019, I think, or 2020, I'm not sure of the year, where 51 people got killed during Jumu'ah. And so, and even that was called an attack of Islamophobia. But of course, had that been a Muslim group who had committed the atrocity, it would have been called terrorism. So the important point for us here now is to take stock of the fact that we need to interrogate this idea of Islamophobia. What does it include? Is it a blanket term that encompasses everything? And then the other issue is that if we're going to immediately categorize all hostilities that are directed at Muslim identities as Islamophobia, then the risk is that we are saying that Muslims are a single entity, that they are a homogeneous group, that they exist in a single geopolitical vacuum, that they all encounter the same kinds of intolerance, hostility, provocation, harassment, threats, intimidation, abuse, and even deaths. And of course, we know this is not the case. So we as a group, as people who are interested in making sense of how we navigate through this world, we've got to guard against just being slipped into particular terms that the West often assigns to us. And so we've got to recognize that the way Muslims experience the public space is entirely different. The way you, in a British context, experience your space and the way that I experience my space in Cape Town, South Africa, is entirely different. And then, of course, intersecting with this idea of Muslim identity and Muslim bodies are the issues of race, gender, culture, class, and geography. And of course, we know, especially when it comes to gender and race, that the experiences of a so-called white Muslim is not going to be the same as the experiences of a so-called Black Muslim. And then similarly as well, that how a Muslim woman accesses the public sphere particularly if she wears a hijab, is entirely different to how a Muslim male accesses and participates in the public sphere. So we are sitting, and the reason why I'm starting with Islamophobia is because I want to highlight to you just how big this problem actually is. And what is the problem? The problem is the increasing hostility and antagonism against those who identify as Muslim. And the only thing which actually gives us a common ground here, if we look at Muslims across geopolitical contexts, the only common factor actually is the fact that we have a shared Muslim identity. Now, it's very clear to me that we are in a state of crisis. This is not meant to be alarmist. I think for a long time, this has been brewing. I think that we have been heading towards this point for a long time. And I do see the Palestinian issue as being at the center of it, and I will get to that later on. But I want us to take cognizance of the fact that wherever you look, in whichever media house you turn to, there's a real sense of Muslims being in a state of crisis. Whether that crisis is perpetuated from the inside or from the outside does not negate the fact that there is a crisis. Now, typically, when we talk about the rising incidence of Islamophobia or the rising suspicion around Muslims and around Muslim identity, we often seem to think it's tied to 9/11. And it might be true that certainly after 9/11, for example, the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs in the US said that since 9/11, the US government marked people of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and Arab descent, and Muslims broadly, as presumed national security threats and targeted their communities for mass surveillance, eroding privacy and individual liberties, and bolstering Islamophobic and xenophobic public narratives. Now, certainly, if you've been traveling through an airport during that time, immediately after 2001, when 9/11 happened, if you were markedly dressed as a Muslim person, you would know exactly what that surveillance and security measures would have entailed, and the endless questioning that you would have endured just to get through a particular custom point or passport point. So yes, there's some truth to that. But at the same time, the suspicion and the hostility and the construction of Islam as this proverbial other religion that's irreconcilable with so-called Western norms and Western values, this is not a new narrative. This is something which comes out of colonialism, which was intent upon constructing the world into those who have value and those who should be taken seriously, who have knowledge which is worthwhile, and those who do not. And if you look at the works of somebody like Maldonado Torres, for example, he refers to the fact that while white people, and I'm talking about those who are interested in white supremacy, when they define themselves, it's what he calls or refers to as a zone of being. In other words, these are real people. They're actual being. Whereas Black people, and that includes Muslims, are going to be seen as zones of non-being. In other words, we are not really seen as having value. There's no real worth to what we have on offer. And if you want to have a clear sense of exactly what that means and how truthful that is, or how that plays out in real life, then look no further than what is happening in Palestine right now. The fact that we are still having debates on trying to decide whether indeed there's a genocide happening, whether indeed people are being starved to death, that these issues are still being up for debate, tells you just how slow the wheel turns when those who have been rendered into the zone of non-being are victimized. Watch, and if you counter the narrative which we have been subjected to with the narrative which arose when Russia invaded Ukraine, then you will get a very clear picture of just how differently the world responds to different kinds of crises, depending on who is at risk. And so this is the kind of thing that plays out. So we see this colonialist narrative, this idea that any kind of identity which does not align itself with Western norms and hegemonies, and any kind of identity which refuses to assimilate to what the West desires and longs to see us as, that particular identity, according to the colonialist framework, which plays itself out right now, then says, well, we now have to find a way of vilifying Muslims. We now need to find a way of denigrating Islam. And I don't have to tell you about the role of social media in that, and just how starkly that narrative has played out, that Muslims are a problematic group, and it's most closely associated with extremism, fundamentalism, as well, of course, the go-to term terrorism. So the way this gets dealt with, particularly in liberal democracies, is you will see things like in France, which I think for me presents the starkest example, and not only in the regulating of the hijab, but certainly in the most recent anti-separatism bill, which they will describe to you as a way of preserving the republic, as a way of preserving a secular state. And it's basically saying we do not want communities to separate themselves from a national identity. We want all people who live in France to abide by a French way of life. And of course, immediately the question you should have for yourself is, but what is a French way of life? And if you unpack it long enough, you'll get to the answer. A French way of life is not an Islamic way of life. So that's at the center of this. And you'll see with the passing of this bill, which was criticized by many within France as well, what it also played out to was, for example, that homeschooling was clamped down, and particularly by Muslim families. Many Muslim families, as would be found in most liberal democracies, opt not to send their children to public schools because of the lack of opportunity to be Muslim, because of the regulation which happens against Muslims. I know an example, there was a situation in the UK most recently where kids are now being prohibited from performing salah at school. So these antagonisms parents try to protect their children from, and they opt for homeschooling. And so now there's this pushback from the French government. And then this other thing which has been permeating, and it's been brewing for a while. It's called the neutrality principle. And what this basically translates into is a prohibition of any civil servants wearing religious symbols. So classic Muslim hijab, any face covering would be prohibited. They also would have banned any display of big crosses or the yarmulke, which is what the Jewish men wear. So they try to kind of say, no, it actually affects everybody. But what again, in this kind of idea of treating all religious symbols the same, the issue, of course, for Muslim women is, and it differs from wearing a cross, for example, is that a cross is something which you can wear as an option, but for some Muslim women, the wearing of the hijab is seen as a compulsory item. It's not something that I really have a choice to do or not to do. So there's this clamp down on the visibility. Now, if we focus and stay on Muslim women, for example, and for me, and I've written extensively on this topic because I do think there's a lot that needs to be unpacked here. And for a very long time, starting most profoundly from 2001, the 9/11, you saw a strong pushback against Muslim women's bodies. And I phrase it as such because it really is, in my mind, it is intrusive. To try and dictate to me what I can and cannot wear is wholly unacceptable. And you've got to take note of the profound irony here, because on the one hand, Muslim women, and here I'm referring to Muslim women who wear hijab. In other words, their Islam is made visible by their dress code. So according to Western liberal democracies, the argument is, and this is just pure speculation on their side, or conjecture, because this is unfortunately how Islam is defined in liberal democracies. No facts necessary. Let's just make up our own minds about things. And the thinking here is that no. So you have this paradox. And what is the paradox? On the one hand, the thinking is from liberal democracies that Muslim women are not wearing a scarf or a hijab because they want to. They're wearing it because they are being instructed to by patriarchal and oppressive Islam. And so the West then says, okay, so you being oppressed, we're going to come along and we're going to liberate you. And we're going to liberate you by forcing you to remove your hijab. So that's the paradox that you really have to be aware of here. And so people like Sheila Ben Habib, who's a Turkish Jewish scholar, and it's important I pointed out to you, because even somebody who's not in the religion can understand this, that Muslim women's bodies have largely become sites of symbolic confrontations. And so there's this increasing stigmatization of women who wear a scarf. And in the French example, it has now become a criminal offense, that you will lose your job, that you will be subject to a fine if you don't adhere to this idea of a neutrality principle. And so suddenly, private reasons for veiling have become the public property of different and competing interests. So that's a typical, and we see this play out increasingly across so-called liberal democracies. And of course, here it's important that you ponder on this, because there's a profound sense of irony here in terms of liberal democracies forcing Muslim women to fit into a particular mold which they deem as acceptable, and not me being allowed to exercise my religious right to dress as I choose. Now, importantly, you will find that in 2017, for example, in a study done in the UK, there was a very high report of Muslim, and the women here were actually university students, that they were more likely to be attacked if wearing distinctly Islamic garments. So there was a spike in 2017. Now, what I also want to point out to you is that the regulation or the attempt to force Muslim women not to wear their scarves, it's not something which is limited to liberal democracies, okay? We also find this in a country like Iran, a Muslim majority country, where, of course, I'm sure you are aware of the most notable incident of Mahsa Amini, who was detained by the morality police or the guidance patrol and taken to a re-education center on the 16th of September 2022, and she died 3 days later. So, okay. And so there you have an example of the same kind of treatment where we will force you either to remove the hijab or we will force you to wear the hijab. Either way, you see a complete distorted interpretation on the one side of what democracy actually is, and on the other side of what Islam says, which is there's absolutely no coercion within the following of Islam. So if I look further now, just to give you some, and I'm going to move through these quite quickly because I want to get to the focus of my talk. If you're going to look at what's happening in Northwest China, for example, you have the Uyghurs are being detained. They're being put into political re-education camps. They are subjected to imprisonment, intense surveillance, religious restrictions, destruction of religious buildings, prohibition of long beards, and as well as Muslim names, and, believe it or not, false sterilizations. So this is another form of ethnic cleansing. And I don't know when last you've seen any of these reports in the mainstream media, because you probably wouldn't have seen it. We have a similar situation happening with the Muslim majority group called Rohingyas in the Rakhine state. If I could just ask people to mute, because it's quite distracting to me while I'm speaking to hear people talking. So if I could ask you to mute, please. Thanks. So what you have here is you have the same thing, ethnic cleansing, genocide. These people, the Rohingyas, are actually denied citizenship. And the same thing is happening in India right now, where people, and if you are denied citizenship, just think about this, right? You are all students, you know, without legitimate papers, legal papers in terms of your citizenship, you are not able to do anything with your life. You can't access any institutions, you can't apply for a job, you can't travel, you are basically stateless. And that's what these people are in. And so many of them have fled and are living in overcrowded camps in Bangladesh. And they have been confined to camps and villages and they are cut off from access of adequate food, healthcare, education, livelihoods. And again, if you look at your mainstream media, you're not going to hear anything about this. But more importantly, as far as I'm concerned, the Muslim Ummah has been silent on just a few crises that I've mentioned. I mean, and now we come home to the one we are faced with now, and immediately, to my shame, the numbers that I have here, the stats that I have up right now, would have probably changed, okay? Because on my last count, when I prepared this, the estimated death toll in Gaza is 35,000 people, of whom 12,300 are children and 8,400 are women. And we single out women because they are more vulnerable, right? And so this is, and I want to say to you immediately, these stats that I have in front of me here now are probably incorrect. I'm pretty sure it's higher, because every single hour there's going to be an addition to these stats. But besides the death, not besides, in addition to the deaths, we have up to 8,000 people missing, and we can presume them to be dead, because we're going to find, as we did with the Bosnian situation as well, you're going to find that bodies would have been buried in mass graves, or they're under the rubble, or they would have been burnt. These things will come to light when eventually the mainstream media wants us to know about it, which will be in a few years' time. But we also know that in addition to the deaths, Gaza is no more. It can hardly be called a home anymore to anybody. Homes have been destroyed en masse deliberately. All the universities have been destroyed on the last time I checked. The 392 educational facilities have been razed. Again, at the point of writing this, 12 out of 35 hospitals are partially functioning. That could very well be less now. 83% of groundwater wells are not operational. And again, that could be higher. And then, of course, 267 places of worship have been obliterated. And if that's not bad enough, as we are sitting and having this talk right now, we know that aid is not being allowed to go through. We know that the Israeli authorities are deliberately blocking it. Israelis are raiding it and taking it for themselves to make sure that it does not reach people who are already at the mercy of the world. And so you have a situation that you're facing a genocide while the world is debating it, but at the same time, there's a famine. And I cannot think of anything worse as for a community, as a mother, to watch children starve to death. But this is exactly what is happening at this very moment. So this is what's happening in the world. I've given you a picture of what's happening to Muslims in liberal democracies. But I also want to say to you that the crises that I'm referring to, it's not limited to so-called liberal democracies. It's not limited to what's just kind of dumbed down to a conflict between Palestine and Israel. We have some serious atrocities, and we have some serious crises that are happening within Muslim majority countries. That's also happening between Muslims and among Muslims. And so we see this in Iran, Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. We see it in Sudan. We have extremely problematic leaders who are basically tyrants in these states. We have dictators. We have murderous military juntas, where the basic civil liberties of people are denied. And to get a sense of that, you will all be aware of the Arab Spring that happened a few years ago, where the MENA region in particular, it started with a student in Tunisia. His name was Mohammed Bouazizi, and he basically was a university graduate, like most of you are, but he was unemployable. He could not find work because of the economic state in Tunisia. And he used to sell apples. And it's worthwhile to repeat the story, because we need to remember this, because this should be defining moments for us. And so here you have a young man who's basically has an apple cart in the public square. and he sells his apples to make a living. And the police decides one day, actually, he needs a new kind of permit to do this, and he doesn't have the correct permit, and they confiscate his apple cart. And this is literally the only way this man can make a living. And he's at a loss, and he's frustrated, and there's a sense of hopelessness. And in that state that he's in, which I can't begin to relate to, he literally sets himself alight, and he dies, and his death puts into motion the Arab Spring. And the Arab Spring was a critical moment, because it was a moment that showed that particularly students have the power to bring about change. And although that change didn't really last long, I mean, we saw the fall of several autocratic governments. We also saw the war in Syria unfold because of it. But it was, for me, a moment of clarity and truth, where the Muslims were beginning to say, we can no longer live in a society where our basic human rights are denied, where there are huge gaps of inequality between those who are in power and the typical person trying to make a living. And you have abject poverty on the one side, and on the other side of the wall, you have a life of absolute indulgence, and castles and palaces and wealth that knows no bounds. To bring it closer to home, maybe, again, currently, we know the situation between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. And again, here we have an estimated 233,000 Yemenis have been killed since 2015. The country has been in a state of conflict for close to 8 years. And like in Palestine, you have the beginning of a serious human-made famine. Over 80% of the population requires humanitarian assistance. 58% of the population faces extreme poverty. And so again, you have what normally happens in this case, you have the displacement of people, where over 4.3 million people have been forced to flee their homes since 2015. And I mean, it's very easy to get lost in the numbers, but it's important for us to ponder on this, because sometimes stats can be helpful to give us a clear sense of the real situation. But I think the risk of the stats is that we lose sight of the human story behind it. So it's important for us to take note of these things. Now, let's get to the heart of this for me. So we know we are in a state of crisis, but I want to alert you to the fact that we actually have two. The two crises are, on the one hand, Muslims are facing large-scale oppression, victimization, and killing, and genocide. We are facing hostilities in liberal democracies. It is very hard for us, for Muslim women in particular, to actively participate in the public sphere of liberal democracies without feeling the need to compromise who she is in terms of how she dresses. And on the other side, if we think it's better in Muslim majority countries, the unfortunate truth, it isn't. So we have a problem. So that's the one crisis. The other crisis for me, and this possibly feeds into why, in particular, we have such a poor state in Muslim majority countries, is the fact that there is a resounding silence. Now, the only time we saw some sort of pushback against Muslim majority countries, as I just pointed to you in the MENA region, was when we saw the Arab Spring, right? That was a hopeful flare of something. But of course, it very quickly kind of fizzled out. But generally, if you look at the situation now, and I've just finished a paper because I was really curious about this, particularly because I'm in South Africa, we have a very strong connection with Palestine historically, because of apartheid, because we are of the opinion that the Israeli state is an apartheid state. And I can honestly say to you, as somebody who had the privilege of being to Palestine and living through apartheid, and in as bad as apartheid was in South Africa while I grew up, it does not come close to what I witnessed in Palestine. So for me, the worry is, particularly as a South African, and the fact that my country has taken it upon itself to lay a case of genocide against Israel, is the fact that if you look at the responses from universities in Muslim majority societies, it's pretty much zero. It does not come close or anywhere close to the kind of resistance and protests that we have seen in South Africa, for example, because that's where it started. And then it went into other spaces, and now it's gone into the US, and it's also gone into the UK, and I've seen in the Netherlands and some in Germany. And so something's happening which is good, and you want this to happen. You want the world to awaken to the atrocities which are happening. You want the world to awaken to just the distorted way Muslims in particular have been forced to live in this world that is so incredibly unequal. But it is a matter of concern that if you look to your Muslim majority countries, there has been no significant pushback. There's absolutely no clarion of voices coming from this. And that to me speaks to a deeper crisis, because that tells us about the state that we are in. Now, there's been many scholars, I'm not the first person to talk about this. Many scholars have written about this in terms of, is this a crisis of knowledge? Is this a crisis of identity? Is this a crisis of being Muslim? What is it? Because there has to come a time. I mean, you can sit here, you can point fingers at the West, and I can put up more slides about the atrocities that are being committed against Muslims, whether in Muslim minority or Muslim majority countries. But at some point, there's got to come a time and ask ourselves, well, what are we doing? That's either adding to the situation or exacerbating the situation. Is our silence playing a role in this? And if you look at the kind of research that's come out of Muslim universities, and if this quote I have up here is from Roshnani Hashim, and she's a Malaysian scholar, and this particular comment she made here was based on her research of universities in Malaysia. Now, Indonesia and Malaysia have amongst the world's biggest Muslim communities. And she says the current Muslim university fails in its goal to produce graduates who can articulate today's pressing issues of democracy, civil society, human rights, gender, environment, non-Muslim, pluralism, language, and globalization. So this is what she's saying. Moreover, she says, they lack the Islamic intellectualism to articulate a lot of pressing contemporary issues, especially in a multi-faith society. And our Islamic higher education has failed to bring the Islamic traditional sciences to bear on other spheres of life. And this is a serious indictment, because on the one hand, you have world-renowned universities in Malaysia, for example, far more considered to be far more progressive and far more active if you compare to universities in Jordan or Oman or in the UAE. So this is an important point that she's raising. Are we spending any time in thinking about what kind of Muslim graduate we are producing? And then from my side, even when we do offer responses to global atrocities, whether it's in terms of 9/11, whether it is our experiences now in liberal democracies, whether it's the story in Yemen or in Sudan or in Syria or in Iran or in Palestine, are we able to offer those responses from an Islamic framework? Do we have a sense of our own history of what it means to be Muslim? And here we need to understand that being Muslim has very little to do with simply saying, oh, I am Muslim. It's supposed to be, it's not a passive identity. It's an active identity. If you are saying that you believe, that you submit, and that you accept the conditions of Shahada, then what does that mean for you? How do you enact this identity in relation to injustices? And this idea that if it's not close to me, it's not my problem. I'm performing my religious obligations. I'm making sure I'm going to mosque and I'm reading my Quran. But the question is, but there's an injustice happening. What are you doing about it? So do we understand that if we are saying that we are Muslim, that there's a particular responsibility upon us, and this is what I want to get to for now. So we know that Islam places an immense emphasis on education. We know that it's considered one of the most important things that we ought to do for our children, and it's something which our Prophet ﷺ encouraged from birth to death. That this pursuit of knowledge is an absolute non-negotiable. And of course, again, the way that has been misinterpreted or just ignored, if you look at certain societies like the Taliban in Afghanistan, for example, we young girls are just taken out of school because they should not learn, that they should not be educated, that it's not necessary for them to be educated. Those kinds of ideas have absolutely nothing to do with Islam. In fact, I would go as far as saying to you that it's completely paradoxical to Islam. And yet you have the perpetuation of these kinds of viewpoints. So what I want to emphasize here is that the matter of education in Islam has no gender. It's not for one, not for the other. It is incumbent upon each and every one of us. Secondly, Islam does not differentiate between theory and practice, or between pure knowledge and applied knowledge, or between revealed knowledge and unrevealed knowledge. Islam places the same emphasis on you learning to recite the Quran as it does upon you getting a qualification that's going to allow you to make a living and take care of yourself and your family and contribute to society. The only knowledge which Islam differentiates between is that which is beneficial to you and that which is not. And of course, I don't have to explain that. So to people like, and again, I'm back to a Malaysian scholar whose work I really enjoy, Naguib Al-Artaz, one of the things he says is that the whole point of seeking knowledge is to produce a good person. I mean, this is so profound. We attach a lot of value to our degrees, our postgrad studies. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. I'm going to get myself published. I'm going to, I'm really going to move through the system. That's fine. There's no harm in that. But you can have knowledge and not be educated. Now, this is important because what Allah says, that if you can have knowledge, you can know about things, but it is only when you are educated that you understand that unless knowledge translates into good character, you have in fact not been educated. So this forces all of us, including myself, to ponder upon, what am I doing with what I know? Am I using it for good? Am I using it to propagate, to capacitate others, to mobilize, to teach, to expand my own learning? Am I using it to become a better person? Or is what I know taking me away from my Islam, taking me away from becoming a good person? Do I go about treating people badly because I think that I'm educated? So this is an important point. And to Hashim's point, a good person will also be concerned about social justice, which is where you and I come in at this particular moment. Now, to bring it home, we are all created in the same way. And the first thing we do with a child, when a new baby is born, the custom is that somebody will recite the adhan and somebody else, or maybe the same person, will recite the iqamah in the newborn baby's ears. I mean, that's certainly a custom in South Africa. And it's meant to initiate this new being into the covenant, which is the Shahada. And what is the Shahada? That I believe in the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that I accept that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the final messenger. And of course, those of us who are reverts, that's something we will say. And that's all you have to do. You just have to utter the Shahada, and that makes you Muslim. But do we think about that? Do we understand that we are now in a covenant with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And what that means is that we're in a trusteeship. We are in a Khalifatullah fil ard. And what that is that I'm in service of Allah. Now, We make the mistake of thinking that worship is confined to our formal rituals. We don't seem to understand that worship extends into taking care of Allah's creation. And there are plenty of verses which talks about of, of justice, of when you see injustice, even if it's against yourself, speak out. If you see wrong, speak out. And you can make salah and you can turn towards this qibla and that qibla, but the best path for you is that of righteousness. So there's a particular ethical responsibility which becomes incumbent upon us if we say, I have received the message, which is I accept the kalima, I accept the shahada, I understand the book, the Quran, my constitution, and I follow the sunnah as presented to me by our Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. If you're saying that is what it means to you to be Muslim, then the question is, how does that acceptance translate into what you do, into how you present yourself to the world? Are you continuing the message that was brought to you through the Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, or are you distorting it? So there's a really important point here that I firmly believe that our role and our responsibility, and every single one of us, we are here for a purpose. We can enjoy the beauty of this world, and we can participate in the beauty of this world, and we can be happy in this world. But there's a greater purpose here. And we've got to figure out what that is in relation to the society that we find ourselves in, as well as beyond our immediate society. And so it's important for us to understand that we have been taught the names of all things. And Allah says this to Nabi when he gets questioned by Iblis, why are you creating Adam, man? The response was that I'm teaching Adam the names of all things. And that's an important point because we have been given the capacity of knowledge. We have been given the capacity to differentiate, to discern, to distinguish between right and wrong. We do have that capacity. We have the capacity to decide how to respond and how to make visible our Muslimness in how we respond to injustices. Because the best of us, the best among us, it's going to be those who have the best of character. And the best of character becomes visible in those of us who have the most compassion and the most empathy. And so when we see these images on our screen of people being mutilated, bombed, and killed and annihilated, or we see a child dying of starvation, that pain should be as if it's happening to one of our own family members. It's not a case of, oh, it's something out there. It's not. We have a connective tie to every single person on this earth, whether they are Muslim or not, because there's no differentiation in terms of who made all of humankind. The same God who made you and I has made the Jew or the Israeli. So, and this is again an important point, because if we talk about the messenger, Nabi Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he was not sent only to Muslims. He was sent as a mercy to humankind. And so we're at a critical moment right now. And it's significant to witness the very slow as it is, there is a slight softening to the people of Palestine from a West which ordinarily would have been incredibly cold. There is a turning of lots of people's views on the state of Palestine. But there's also a response to the Islam that's being witnessed in Palestine right now, that's making people wonder about this deen and giving people insight into this deen. And so it does come down to people like us, and I say us, because we claim to have some knowledge. We are interested in pursuing education. And so now the responsibility is, what do we do in this moment? And what do we do in the face of any other crisis, which is going to come away? And the only way we are going to be able to respond to this moment of crisis is to have a full comprehension of what it means to be Muslim and what it means to enact my Islam and to take responsibility for the covenant that I'm in. I've noticed I'm well over time, so I'm going to stop there.